Hello, and welcome to the Improving Edge. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning. Presenting today is Patricia Kong. Patricia is the product owner of Enterprise Agility at Scrum.org, a co-author of the Nexus Framework for Scaling Scrum, and she mentors Agile leaders as part of her work with Scrum.org. The topic for today is Agile for the Future. Take it away, Patricia.
Hello, everyone. Hello again. Thank you for having me. If you had participated in this conference last year, I was one of the speakers, and I think I was doing it from my attic. So this year, I am not in my attic. I am in the Scrum.org office in the Boston area, Massachusetts, actually on top of, we're on the second floor on top of where the Scrum framework was actually created. So I'm here by myself in air conditioning in the corner, and I'm happy to be talking to you today. So I am going to elegantly try to share my screen. And the conversation that I wanted for us to have today was about things that 2020 taught us about the future of work and the reflections that we've had together at Scrum.org as a community with other people. 2020 obviously was much more than just the pandemic. And all of those, I'm going to say, crises and all those realizations have triggered some different ways for us to think about how we can move forward and what that means for not only the future of work, but the future of Agile. I am going to try to be a little more interactive today as much as I can. So we're going to have a place, and I'll show you, we're going to be using a little tool. It'll be very easy. Even I managed it. Where we can interact and share some knowledge together, since there are a bunch of us. So let's get started. About me, Enterprise Agility and Leadership at Scrum.org. So Scrum.org is the home of Scrum. We're partners with Improving. And what I think about there is when we think about Scrum and Agile at the team level, how do we expand that and get that goodness and success at the enterprise level? So we look at different structures, think about different systems, and also the behaviors of people when they're relating together. So things that I think about are around scaling, and a framework that I've co-developed is called evidence-based management. So when we are looking at how successful we are at being agile, or how can we improve, what is the evidence that we need to be able to manage and holistically gather that information so that we can make decisions to move forward. You heard that I was a mentor. I mentor young people to bridge the opportunity gap. So those people are usually 18 to 21, and then also people in the Agile industry, Scrum Masters. And so I like to think about how people think, and then I like to apply that and share that information with the future. So Scrum.org, this is who we are. We focus on training, education, and community. This is still who we are. And it's just to show you the breadth of people. Here we are still in 2D. All right, so 2020, it happened. And luckily, some of us have been able to thrive through it. But there's a lot of different scars and learnings that we've had. And it's almost unfortunate, some of the propelling that 2020 has driven for people to focus on Agile, but it's true because it's forced them to do that. So the first thing that I'd like to do is really ask you, because we're going to go into the lessons that a lot of organizations have learned, but that would be nothing without the people that are actually part of the organization. So I'm going to ask you to go to menti.com, and I think Mike's going to put it into the chat, but it's MENTI. And then you're going to use this code 5280-3121. And you're going to have a spot to put in 3 boxes, three areas for text. And you can put in what word or phrase best describes the theme you learned in 2020. So that might mean social justice. That might mean, you might be thinking about mortality. You might be thinking that planning isn't everything. I'm going to encourage you and invite you to do that, and I'll show the results as I gracefully try to toggle my screen. Let's see. All right. Look at that coming in. Emotional intelligence, thankfulness. So I'm going to give everyone a minute to do that. And while we're filling that in, I'll give you a fun fact, 2 fun facts. So something that was happening that came up during COVID, just because we're locked in, or we were locked in. Some people just stayed at home, and the average American spent during Q1 of 2020, according to Nielsen, 3 hours and 43 minutes every day watching live TV. Every day, which is a little less than the 3 hours and 46 minutes we spent on our smartphones. So that's just a little fun fact of what a lot of us were doing, I suppose, besides, working and trying to manage family and drinking and doing all those things. All right, so when we look at the word cloud here, flexibility is coming up, gratitude, opportunity, patience. Patience is getting bigger. COVID-19, maintain positivity, mental health, isolation, change agility. So this is fun to see. Heart, disconnected. I feel you. I feel all of these things. I hear it. Mute. You're on mute. Thank you for continuing to put these in. So I'll have those results, which I'll include in the PowerPoint slide. But let's see what else we're going through and the lessons that we learned from 2020 as organizations and places of work. So here we are, we're back. So what we know this because we've been told this many times, probably in 20 million presentations that we've seen in the last 6 months. So there's this study from McKinsey that organizations with an agile mindset have been able to fare better. And they've been able to fare better than 2020. And it's almost like 2020 gave a crash course in complexity. I'll put it that way. What I'm going to share now, what we'll go through, are the lessons that were learned, which may seem obvious to some of us, depending on the environments that we work in. But you'll see more text also in the slides that I have more than usual, because I think if there are lessons that you're looking to learn and you'd like to share them in conversations with your colleagues, I wanted to make sure that you had those points there rather than just me talking. So 2021, here we are, we're here. And I'm still, 2021 is kicking my butt just as hard as 2020, except I'm a little less hungover. But the question that I get is still almost the same, regardless of the pandemic and COVID and 2020 and all that stuff, right? But how do we we know that Agile is helping us, and we know that this is the way that we can work and get stuff done. How do we increase agility, raise productivity, and empower employees while maintaining a connected workplace culture? That's the crux of the question that is still coming this way. And it's the same question that we were getting 2 years ago versus today. But here are some of the things that we learned from the 5 lessons. First one, just go right into it. People don't need to be in the office to do amazing work. So there were a lot of conversations when we were coming into this of how, if companies were not used to it, how are we going to have people work from home, work remotely? How are we going to train and do conferences? What about the relationship that people need to have? But we found that working from home, if it was possible for us to do it, and a privilege for us to do it because we didn't have to risk certain things, those things could happen. And the question now is to what extent? So a lot of companies are looking at readiness surveys and trying to gauge that. And they're swinging left and right to the left and right of what people want. So you'll see here that 70% of executives expect hybrid remote work for select staff. And they're trying to figure out what we see is, what is that magic number? Do we need that magic number? Is that magic number 2 days remote work, 3 days? How do we make sure that people are engaged? Well, the thing is that we've seen that people are been engaged because that's what we've been doing for the past year. And what we're doing now, at least at Scrum.org, is really using offices as a place for collaboration and activities where we can benefit from engagement. So things like coaching, things like brainstorming. The consideration that companies are thinking about, that need to consider when they're making these decisions, is when we're thinking about that connection, how, besides the type of work that's being done, how introverted or extroverted are the individuals? So someone like me, who's a little more extroverted, it's becoming hard where I don't feel connected. And when I do these one-off, when I do these one-way kind of talks, I feel like I'm just talking to a wall. How are we making sure that people like me get that engagement? Whereas people who are like, I am thriving, they feel a little guilty, but they're thriving because they're having the conversation, they're getting their tasks done, and they don't have to have the small talk when they don't want to. So the question there is, how do we maintain that connection? And I think one thing that we've definitely learned is that with all the video conferencing that we're doing is that people are used to and need that face-to-face communication. So regardless if I'm a extrovert or not, when people used to like FaceTime or whatever, WhatsApp message me, video message me, I'd like hang up. Now it's really normal because we're just used to looking at each other in whatever state exists. The important thing that I want to point out here, two important things, is it depends on your company. So a lot of people are saying, we want to be able to have full-time remote and all that stuff. But if you actually survey and ask your employees, there's a mixture of what wants. So in a 2020 survey, there was a large 1B plus company, architecture and design consulting firm. So they have over 6,000, 7,000 employees. And when they asked, only 19% of people actually really want to go full-time remote, right? They have whatever reasons that they have, family or whatnot, space. But as we start to think about, are we going to have employees work from home? There's a question of subsidy. Do our companies going to subsidize for that environment for people to be able to work from home? Are there costs then that are being taken away from other areas? Do we lessen the size of reduce the size of our office space, et cetera? So that's one thing. The other thing is that this notion of remote work and hybrid remote working is encouraging something that's really interesting, that's rare, that we usually see in companies, which is this notion really of self-management. For Agilists, we really grok this, but the self-determination of how am I going to manage my day today as an adult? I have to do this. Oh, I'm going to work from home. I'm going to be in meetings. I'm going to work from home. Oh, I need to, I want to work out in the morning till 10 a.m. I'm going to do that. I'm going to work from home. But I need to focus. I need to collaborate. I'm going to go to the office. This freedom that it's allowing is really encouraging that bit of self-management. And when we don't do that, that lack of choice is and will push people to move to other companies. So a study found that over 50% of middle income workers are looking for jobs, and the thing that would allow them to move, but that would push them to move, is the ability to go and choose hybrid work. So something to consider. Next thing, and these lessons are all intertwined in a different way because we're trying to think about how to interact with people. So employees and companies can share emotional space. And there's two sides to this. This is really about how are we working with employees and with each other to manage our mental health, and how are we showing up. And it's become very, I guess, normal to say, how are we bringing our authentic selves to the table? I used to be known for, oh, Patricia, you're very authentic. You're pretty transparent, because I'll just say it. And that doesn't mean that I'm being my true authentic self, but it's just being super transparent. The question for companies and HR leaders, especially, and leaders in general, is to ask, what are the boundaries? So what are the boundaries when we think about that emotional space and our preferences of how we show up at work? Right now, a lot of these things are becoming intertwined, right? People are hungry for social reform and distrust social institutions. There's a lot of things that are going out there that are taking up headspace, as they should. And so that's making us question where we work, who do we want to work for, why are we doing this? Is this actually helping to contribute to things that we value as people? So the values that a company have, the values that you may see, for instance, of how you present yourself to the world, is something that I think speaks to people who are from the Agile industry, because we know, for instance, that Scrum is based on 5 values, right? So these values and how does that translate to the mission and what we're trying to improve and the visions that we have are important. So a company has to decide what is that boundary of how we're going to show up and what conversations we're going to dip into. And the important thing here is regardless of how you dip into those conversations, is that you need to be transparent, because all of this is a transition. So the complexity of that means that you need to really inspect and adapt what's right or wrong, right? So there's a lot of expertise out there, but everybody's trying to figure out in this world what they want to do. I will say that having those values, having those initiatives, and making those things transparent is attractive to talent too, as we think about who we want to work for. So the question that we've been asking ourselves, even at Scrum.org, but different companies, is when you think of your company, or you think of yourself, what are you a steward of in society? What are you trying to contribute back? And who knows that? And who believes that, right? So improving enterprise is improving. It's in their name. We know that they think about improving. And is that about the community? Is that about this? How do they translate that into society? Is a really interesting question that they've been thinking about. So those are some things that we have to understand. And this is a tough one, because it really is what are the boundaries? How do we share that mental space? Are we embracive of, for instance, we need a mental health day? How do we notice, because we're remote, when people need help? Are we meant to reach out? And this is where it dives into this notion of teams. So when teams work together, how are they collaborating? And if they're committed to doing something together, when we need to pick up slack from somebody else because there's something else going on, we do that. One of the things that, I kind of made a joke earlier was about all the hangovers I had in the beginning of COVID, which is true. But then I just recently have been going down these different paths because, for instance, this is a topic where we have to understand for enterprise agility and success. And so I've been diving into, organizational behavior and psychology topics, and thinking about shame and courage and vulnerability and all those kind of things. And recently I've been giving workshops on shame. And recently I did a workshop, lots of research, have to learn a lot about myself to get to that point. I was thinking about how empty I felt at the end. And I was talking to my coach, and she said, well, darling, you're having a vulnerability hangover. So just know that this is a lot. And at some point you may just feel super disconnected, and that's okay. Just back away from it and you can come back. So that's the second point. Third point that we learned over 2020 is that goals absolutely drive focus. This is obvious. The problem is that a lot of the times we don't see goals that are transparent. So they aren't there providing that focus. And so the question is, when leaders are able to provide that focus with these goals, from these strong, ambitious goals, big, ambitious goals that we have, how does that help us as an organization, people, move toward that? And so one of the things that we have to think about is this notion of outputs versus outcomes, which has become more common language. So not think about goals that are just based off of the widgets that we've provided, but on actual outcomes, because 2020 did not give us that luxury to willy-nilly anymore. So we have to really focus on what we're trying to do. At Scrum.org, with my coworker, Kurt Bittner, that pushed us to think about what are some of the models when we think about leadership of what leaders should be looking at and how their intention matters. And we started to observe this behavior. If you look at the notion of empowering teams, the more that we're building trust and empowering teams on the right side of this graphic, the more the focus of the leader can start to not be from what are the activities that people are doing, what are the outputs, maybe not even the outcomes that we're getting into, but what are the societal impacts that we are having back into the world, because that is a huge thing of 2020. And we know that shareholders, are driven, and people are driven, and stakeholders are driven by financial motive, obviously. But there are huge motivations now that are being exposed, marketed around pro-social movement and expressive movements. So when we think about that, and if you can have that sort of mindset, the agile mindset that's helping us be more transparent, increasing trust, creating a space where we can try things, now leaders can really think about how, as an organization, do we want to present ourselves to society and give back. And that's really, if people are familiar here with the fixed mindset and growth mindset, which is, fixed mindset is like, I can only do one thing one way. Growth mindset is, I can do things and it'll make me greater, it'll make me stronger, blah, 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 blah. But there's this notion of the benefit mindset, which goes beyond that, which says, what can I do to help us? So it really changes the notion of from I to we, and that's a societal impact. So just a short ditty on that. On the left side of this graphic, you're seeing the notion of micromanagement. So if you have less trust, you're probably going to micromanage more. And that's this interesting thing around control. I have a picture of fences here, and this is just to trigger me to comment on this. There was a study on a playground. And this was brought up by a blog by the chief people officer at Forrester Research, which is a really good blog, actually, and it's called Fences. But what this study showed was that when they had fences and they had children playing during recess, is when they had fences, the boundaries, the focus of where we could play, the children were more apt to spread out and go in different places. When they didn't, when it was a large open space during recess, the children were apt to stay in small groups close to the teacher. And so I think in the same way, when we provide those boundaries, which was what things in the frameworks that we think about, Scrum, I think about Nexus for scaling Scrum and evidence-based management, when we provide those guardrails, that allows people to experiment and try and go in different places. And I think that goals and focus play nicely in that area. So here's a slide with a lot of text. The fourth lesson, which is very obvious, is that we had to figure out our ability to pivot. Ability to pivot saved us. Crisis pushed us to be able to pivot. And we've seen crisis push companies probably try to adapt agile at different times outside of 2020. The question that we were being asked was, how do we gauge our ability to pivot? And so what companies were doing was that they were trying to calculate and measure this notion of time. So we're just looking at time and, what is our speed? And so we said, that's great. You can measure maybe your cycle time or how long it takes you to get something done. But let's start to think about if you have time to pivot as a measure of agility. It's okay, it's good. And the measure of time to pivot is the elapsed time run from when you receive information. So that's the starting time to when you respond to it. That's good, but it needs to be looked at with two other areas, in my opinion. So evidence-based management, I mentioned that in the beginning. What this looks at, you need to look at your ability to pivot in terms of innovation. So what's the time that it takes you to do that, along with a key value area called ability to innovate. So what's holding you back or helping you innovate, and unrealized value. Unrealized value here is the game changer because it asks you to think about why you're doing it. What is that gap that you're actually trying to close? What is the need that you are trying to fulfill that you are not currently fulfilling with that pivot? So you could think about restaurants during COVID. We could think about how we're looking to satisfy people wanting to eat outside, people wanting to have that experience of eating at home, which has probably changed now. Everybody wants to go and live the way that they are, depending on where you are. When you think about social justice, how do we close the gaps? How do we start to elevate and not exclude? Those sorts of things are what you would think about for unrealized value. The economy has asked us to pivot and forced us to pivot in different ways. So if you think about that stream, if our clients are not making as much money and they're thinking about how do we invest our dollar today to get more out of it than we could yesterday, that means that we need to think about, as partners, how do we start to think about how we invest our money and what matters to us, to have that partnership in terms of what can we do and be creative about how we're working together. So this is one, forcing relationships to become more outcome based. It might be outcome driven. It might even ask us to think about, actually, you know what, all of that's really nice, but what we want to figure out right now is how we can contribute more to society. But what it's asking us to do is, when we think about how we invest and we think about what's going on, what overhead needs to be stripped away, and how do we start investing and managing risk and making those small bets. These are things that we've talked about for many years in the agile industry, and it's coming in fruition now, and it's becoming a very strong theme. And these are one of the things that are becoming more palatable to some organizations, larger organizations, and they're trying to experiment more as we are in this complex time. The last lesson, and these are all big ones, they could have half an hour for each one, each point. We need employees who can adapt to fluid and learning intensive environments. So think about when we talk about cross-functionality and how we need people who are general with some sort of expertise. There's this pattern, the transition of thinking about two things. One, yes, we need people who have strong technical skills. Those people definitely need to be master their craft. But there is this development of skill that people are looking for, and it was very apparent in that word cloud that we're developing about social and cognitive skills. And think about now, as agile coaches, as Scrum masters, as leaders, as product owners, how do we think about it as developers? How do we now think about that accountability and what we need to do to help fulfill a certain goal as a team, and the different sort of skills that we need to adapt? So now this whole notion of employers being able to keep employees happy, they need to provide that opportunity for continuous and cross-learning. The thing here, and you can see here some of the data that I put here. So around 2030, Deloitte has said, 70 to 90% of workers will be working in hybrid or super jobs. Mental agility, psychological hardiness, some of the things that people are looking for is this ability to kind of change, inspect, and adapt. And they're realizing, because things change, we need to have that ability to be flexible. The thing that it makes me think here are two things. So there was this notion of, what do we think is a good predictor of leadership ability now? So I think that generally we're looking at, when we've looked at that in an agile organization, in that culture, we're looking for certain types of behaviors, a certain type of self-confidence. But there was something when I was doing the research here, and when I've had conversation that seems to be excluded from the data, but that's very important when we think about agile behaviors and cultures, is humility. Because we talk about, this, we're trying to remove this ability to control and predict. We're trying to be able to embrace failure. That's going to require humility and a bunch of humor. So those are things that I think, and maybe psychological hardiness exists. But the question that I have here, which I'd be interested in exploring, is when we are looking for characteristics and personalities, are those things that are taught? Is that done by doing, learning by doing? And is there a question of exclusion here? So those are things that are fascinating to me about this. And I like that in the heading where we think about fluid learning intensive environments. 2020 has done that to us, but think about generally when we're thinking about work, it should always be a fluid learning intensive environment. When we are thinking about, if we're training a course, that's always a beta for us. It's always new. We're always trying something new. So those are the things that need to be there. So for me, when I think about those 5 themes, and it was, we talked about, people don't need to be in the office to do amazing work. We're still going to have to figure out what that balance is depending on your company. Emotional space. What is that boundary? How do we address mental health? I was just on a podcast where we talked about burnout, and we talked about how when things happen, we naturally will revert to our learned behaviors, or our original behaviors, which for me is very dominant. Goals, thinking about what types of goals that we actually have and how that's actually helped us focus. I think the other thing that's super important about goals is that when you make those transparent, you actually now can have a conversation that is focused on value as an organization rather than just on politics. And the other thing there is that the other thing that's positive around making large strategic goals very transparent is that in another way for leaders and executives, what leaders and executives can do is now make decisions based off a holistic view of not something that's showing lines and colors and graphics and looking at a project, but really looking at the state of business of a product. So think about that. The state of the goal. What is the progress on the goal, which is hopefully to provide a service or product of value to someone? How do you start to have those conversations? And that's for a separate talk, or the talk I did last year, which is around evidence-based management. This is a word cloud that is a result from when we were polling different individuals, different Agilists on an Agile culture. You can see transparent and collaborative. And when I think about those where we talked about the people don't need to be in the office to do amazing work, employees and companies can share emotional space, that we need goals to drive focus, and that we need to be agile in order to pivot, and that employees need to be able to be relearn and learn. All these words came up, and for me, that was really about engagement. And for me, when I think about the future of Agile, it demands engagement. Success of Scrum, success of Agile demands engagement. And it will separate the notion of we have the fundamentals that we understand versus we are really professionals and bringing our A game here. And it will separate companies that are just thinking about surviving versus companies that are thinking about how they can thrive and how they can pivot and how they can relearn, and be humble in the notion of we are maybe experts in our field, but we're all apprentices in some way and continuously relearning, because the traditional predictors are no longer relevant for us. So I am going to ask you, please, to go back on menti.com, and I'm going to set this up for you. And this is just a way for us to interact a little bit more with each other. Go to menti.com, enter the code 52803121, or if you're already on that screen, it's going to show you. And just feel it's open text to enter some of the things that you've learned from today, your insights. And I'll share that, and it'll be on the screen in a flowing grid. And as we get into that, that will hopefully help us with some questions. Never go back to pre-COVID. Future of jobs are agile. They certainly ask for those behaviors. The stages of leadership. And you'll see more coming from us there, looking at the stages of leadership, almost to the extent of a maturity model. So it's good to think about that. I like that question. Isn't Agile just good management practices rebranded? I don't know if it's rebranded, but yeah, I don't agree. This whole notion of the stances. So as those are scrolling, take a look at them, and I actually have no clue where my timer is, but I'm able to take questions. Do we have any questions? Let's see, where is this box?
We don't have any questions yet, so if attendees would like to submit their questions now, it would be a good time.
Wow, I want to work with you, Patricia. Don't know who you are, but thank you. The survive and thrive thing might sound a little bit aggressive from my part when I talked about the future of engagement. It's going to separate that. But when we think about what companies really are looking for, they're looking to sustain themselves. And it's about, you know, what are the reasons that companies, what has separated the companies that have been able to sustain themselves and not? And now we're at that another pivot point. I mean, there are companies that face that every day, right? You know, depending on your industry. And we are lucky to be in knowledge work, I would say. But what's interesting is that, what does that mean as a person? And then I think that the other dynamic that I've been thinking about is generational motivations. So what was Gen, I don't know who that generation, but the generation Y, Z, which one is that? The older generation and the baby boomers. I shouldn't have said that. Baby boomer generation, millennial generation, geriatric millennials, and then the students who are just getting out. What motivates them? What types of jobs are coming at them? Do they want actually something where it's a 9 to 5, very autonomous, so that they can use that money to buy Bitcoin? There's different ways that people are trying to think about things.
I do have a question coming in.
All right.
I see a lot of hype around Agile as a term. How would you describe what it means? Because it is hard to find a definitive description of what it is. Is it a culture, just management principles? What's the intended goal?
I think there is a lot of hype around the word Agile. And I say that as somebody who thinks about Agile on a daily basis. And I want to be careful to not exclude people who say, you know what, I'm just getting into this. And it really helps me think about the tenets. What we think about from Agile, and you can geek out and talk about the history of why the word Agile was chosen from the Agile Manifesto, blah blah blah, and they could have used the word adapt, and they could have used all these things. When I think about agility, for me, it's just a different way of meeting a goal, and it is a different way of working to try to meet that goal. So when we are working in complex situations, we want to be able to have certain behaviors that allow that. And so for me, I don't think actually that you can just go, we're building an Agile culture. What I think is that you need to create a space where there are certain behaviors that will exist, where you can embrace empiricism, where you can have a space where you can fail, where you can laugh about when you fail, where you can be super focused and be humble about those things and be committed to working with each other toward a goal. When you can create that environment and when teams are allowed to do that, you are going to see an Agile culture develop. And there'll be the chicken and the egg, what comes first. But I think that ability to do those things gets us developing the muscle of what our people are typing in right now, right? Good leaders are critical, mental agility. How do we think about leadership? All those different types of practices is what's going to support that. And for me, the goal in the end is never to be Agile, right? The goal is to provide more value. And the question now is the value, not just for customers, but the value is for the people who are doing the work. When I think about evidence-based management, and when we talk about key value areas of how organizations try to sustain, it's separated out for me into 4 different areas. Current value, where you are now, unrealized value, what's going on, what the opportunities are, your time to market, and your ability to innovate. Now, we look at ability to innovate, we can look in the product, we're going to look at, who's using what kind of tech debt do we have, all those things, what's holding us back. When we think about employees, when we think about people, that's very much in the value of company, but it's also a strong area of innovation for the company. What are we doing to enable the employees so that they can innovate? What's that trust conversation? Because maybe there's a lot of information that's held, a lot of knowledge that's held, but it's not being shared. How does that hurt us from being innovative? So the environment of what's being set up to create that sort of Agile culture where we can inspect and adapt, we can be real, and we're going to get stuff done. That's for me what's Agile. That's really long-winded. I apologize.
I think it's a great answer. I do have a message from Greg here too, who says, while many organizations have just been surviving, the time to thrive is right now. And his question is, can Scrum be used to drive an Agile culture and change the way every team works?
Could you repeat the last question? Last sentence?
Can Scrum be used to drive an Agile culture and change the way every team works?
I mean, can it? We could try. I don't think that it's very successful when we go, you must do Scrum now. Scrum is working really well there. Now you're all going to do Scrum, right? That's usually what gets us into this notion of zombie agile transformation, zombie Scrum. It's what separates amateur versus professionalism in a company. And it also has to ask the question, is this what's right for that type of work? So I think there are elements that you start to add and see if the people think that it's the right thing to do for them. I was in a conversation where I was talking to an operations person and she said, oh, I wanted us to do an Agile and Scrum, but there was that developer and he just wouldn't do it. Just wouldn't do it, and that's why it didn't work. So she said, okay, you don't want to do it, we won't do it. And that's getting away from the question and the conversation about how do we collaborate more? How do we actually, how are we thinking about the customer? What is our commitment to our goals? And what environment are we providing for learning?
That does remind me of a term I often hear people say, agile with a little a, the meaning behind agile, not just the frameworks and set practices.
Yeah, and it's agile with a big A, or now there's actually a whole scandal about should agile have a big A or a little a in agility when we talk to analysts.
The next question I have from Jack is, what is your first piece of advice to leaders on how to lead agile teams in the future?
How to lead agile teams in the future? Step back. Tongue in cheek, but yeah, I think when we're looking at what that means is how do you, and there's the term that was actually just removed in the Scrum guide, but there's this whole notion of servant leadership as a stance. When we're looking to lead, what impediments do we need to remove? How do we remove those blockers? How do we become champions for those teams? And one of the things that we've learned over COVID is this need for partnership and partnering with other customer companies, partnering with our customers. How do we start to partner that way to try to break down those walls? I think to be a good leader, you also have to look at yourself, because there's this notion of exhaustion that exists when we are continuously improving. And there was a point that I hit during this time where it's like, man, I am tired of improving, because I didn't know what I was improving towards. So a good leader is always, making that goal transparent, learning from the team. And that's the type of environment that needs to exist. So that's kind of like no ego, amigo kind of thing that exists.
I have a question from Frederick. What will a thriving and successful business look like in 2023?
Man, I am just trying to make it out of 2021.
That's what I thought.
Yeah. In 2023, I think that depends for that company, right? I think that one other trend that I didn't mention, because I had the boundary of 5, is I think that we will start to see things a little bit more small. The number of people will be more small. Things will be more nimble in that way, because we will start to think about, 1, removing overhead, and 2, 1, removing overhead, and now I've forgotten the second one, but this notion of how do we do things quickly, and how many people do we actually need to get there, will be something that we re-examine. And that has to do with that notion of, we're looking for those cross-functionalists to develop that general behavior, and everybody's learning. And when we're doing that and everybody has this sense of newness and not, oh, I know how to fix that problem. I think that that's the type of this rapid learning cycle. The thing that also will exist, that's going to progress, I think, 2 years isn't that far, is that I think that with this view of less is more, there will be looking at what do we already know in terms of how we work together. not just, about a certain thing, how to solve a problem. We don't take the same way to solve a problem of a new thing. But if we know how to use Scrum, for instance, the transition that I see now is that companies are saying we do not have the luxury to have all of these other things, to think about processes that much. If we know Scrum, how do we move on to Nexus? Because we do have 3 teams now, 4 teams now, and they already understand the muscle of using Scrum and the behaviors that are allowed and expected when we're on a team working together toward a thing. So Nexus is the bigger sister of the Scrum framework, from Ken Schwafer and Scrum.org. So we're seeing a lot of that because it's something that people understand, and they can use that similar language. So there's not a lot of retraining there in that sense.
I have an observation from Don. He says, we have taken a step back in our organization in collaboration during the pandemic. Instead of our product owners and development team collaborating during ideation phases, we have fallen more into the POs will provide complete requirements instead of the collaboration ideation. I'm assuming he means by how it's facilitated in person versus remotely. So how do we come out of this?
I think Don's on a good path of talking about it and understanding that it's a way that's already moved. So if Don recognizes that pre-COVID we weren't doing this when we were all together, but now we're doing this, the question is why and who is that benefiting? And if we're not seeing any value come out of that in the end, then let's change that. I don't think that it's anything different than what we would do if we were using Scrum and Agile in the first place. That collaboration and the better ways that we need to collaborate is also a conversation there in terms of, do we still like and enjoy working with each other versus is it valuable for the company? And I think that that's the thing that we always remember, is that if there is a vision of the product owner, and is that person is truly the product owner, what are we doing as we spend that person's money for the organization, and how is that benefiting the customer?
And I have one last question, and you've touched on this a little bit, but Frederick is asking, have you seen data on micromanagement and has it improved?
I haven't seen, I may have seen, but I didn't think about it deeply. I'll put it that way, about micromanagement, but we have strong data. But what we have done is really examined the concept of trust and safety in 2 aspects. I've been looking at this. Trust and safety versus when there's a goal, if that is clear and exists, when it doesn't. It doesn't matter if you don't have trust and safety, and what practices are allowing that to happen. So I would say there's probably an exercise to think here. I should probably just pull the data that I have there, but there's the exercise of looking at, does trust and safety even, is that what needs to come first? Does it matter if you have goals if there's no trust and safety? How do you move towards something? Does that build more trust? We know that in order to have true trust, you need to have conflict and resolve it. That's something that even for young kids, they need to see that resolution of conflict. And then I've looked at trust and safety in terms of an environment and also self-confidence. And that goes into this notion of shame or not shame, and how we feel and interpret shame. So we think about the environment that we're in, if we feel safe there, and the confidence that we have in ourselves depending on that environment. And that has been interesting in looking at 4 areas. And that is family, culture, partnerships, relationships, and I think it's society. Those types of expectations and what we have in terms of trust there. So that's very, very multi-layered. But all these questions are really good, and please email me or hit me up on LinkedIn and send me a message. And I'll be happy to have more conversations about this. I think it's great stuff for us to think about and put out as we think about apparently 2023.
Well, let's go ahead and wrap this webinar up. Patricia, thank you very much for presenting today at the Improving Edge conference. And again, if the attendees would like to discuss any of this content further with Patricia, reach out to her on her LinkedIn or email. And remember to join the rest of the sessions all week at the Improving Edge conference. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.